Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Bonjour, Atheists in Recovery land, and welcome to episode 65 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we are talking to David Poses, and I'm excited about sharing this interview with everyone. I found David on Twitter, actually, and his tweets are remarkable. I mean, he's so vulnerable about his story. And anyway, I think you're really going to like the show. So today we talk a little bit about how a cop at David's high school had quote unquote sold him on using opioids when he said that opioids are used as a painkiller. And David thought, well, I'm in pain. So it was mental pain, but I'm in pain. So this will work for me. And he sort of romanticized the drug until not much longer after that, until he started using heroin as a symptom of a much bigger problem. But back in the 90s, these prominent addiction treatment centers, all they would use were 12-step models, and abstinence was sort of the only way. And there are a lot of treatment centers today that will only use that model as well. So David wasn't buying into that. He felt that he doesn't have a higher power, and he talks a little bit about his spirituality in the beginning, but he doesn't have a higher power. He doesn't believe that this prayer answering God is going to come down and save him. And so he really struggled with treatment until years later he found buprenorphine. And so he talks a little about buprenorphine as, a maintenance drug and how that really saved him. And we also talk a little bit about drug policy towards the end, and David talks about his miracle future. Okay, on to my guest, David Poses. David is a writer and activist at the intersection of science and policy for drugs and addiction treatment. He lives in New York with his wife and kids. David is a recovering heroin addict. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoy the show. David Poses, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So I am very excited to have you here. And I want to start this conversation inquiring about your deepest roots from childhood.
I was depressed before I knew what depression was. I have so many memories from, as far as I can remember, of my mom asking, why are you so sad? Don't you want to be happy? And I didn't know why I was sad. And I knew that I didn't want to be sad, but I didn't know how to talk about it. And I felt like something was terribly wrong with me. Of course I want to be happy, but I can't, make it happen. Mm-hmm. My parents divorced when I was 4, and then my mom started taking me to weekly therapy sessions. And the shame of the depression was just as bad with a psychiatrist. So I didn't feel comfortable talking about it. And I basically just kind of honed my acting skills.
Oh, wow.
At a very young age, and learned how to smile and tell jokes and deflect. And that was that. So they put me on anti-depressants in my early teens, and nothing worked. I had heard about heroin in 5th grade at a drug prevention assembly. This cop came to my school and he told us why you don't want to drink because you can't drive, and you don't want to smoke pot because it makes you stupid. And he had something to say about every substance, and they all sounded, I had no problem with the just say no vow until he got to heroin. And he said it was originally a painkiller, and it's so powerful that it makes you not have any feelings. And he said that, like it was bad. And
right.
I'm in. And he talked about the poppy flower, this evil flower that it comes from. And I remember that scene from The Wizard of Oz where the Wicked Witch, makes the poppies appear in the field, and you can just see, Dorothy and everybody relax. So, I was hooked long before I started using. Yeah.
What do you think was so appealing about heroin and that, made you sort of romanticize it, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, I guess like that really turned me on. The Cop was the greatest endorsement. And then after that, I started noticing that all the music that I was listening to, I got very much into the Sex Pistols in like 6th and 7th grade. And Sid Vicious. So it just kind of, and I was into Jean-Michel Basquiat's art and Charles Baudelaire's poetry. So like all of my favorite artists had some kind of opioid something. And, so I like by the end of 9th grade, I had tried a few antidepressants and nothing worked. My friends were using alcohol and pot, like, garnishes for activities. I smoked pot a couple of times and I really just couldn't stand it. Mm-hmm. And it was the same. I got drunk once in my life and I hated it. The feeling of being intoxicated, it just wasn't for me. I mean, reality was not my problem. I was the problem. So by the time I got to heroin, I was just wanting to die. And it made everything okay. For the first time, everything was okay.
Yeah. I want to step back just a minute and ask you if there was any spiritual or religious component to your upbringing. Did you have a spiritual background growing up at all?
Yes and no. I was raised Jewish. Both of my parents are Jewish. I had a bar mitzvah. But I grew up in Westchester County in New York, and there's certainly no shortage of, very devout religious Jews, but Judaism in my circle was more of like not so much spiritual as social, like you congregate with the Jews at the country club and sleepaway camp and stuff. So it wasn't so much the spiritual side as much as it was just you know that you're a Jew and you're hanging out with wall-to-wall Jews everywhere, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not so much spiritual, just more social.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I had a bar mitzvah. I remember, I went to Hebrew school and it was very much, there wasn't so much emphasis on learning Hebrew as much as memorizing the Hebrew stuff, the songs and the Torah and learning how to read and stuff like that. So most of the time I didn't even know what I was saying, and that it's hard to, get into the spiritual component of that when it's like, you're just reciting, phonetics basically. So, okay.
Yeah. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more now about your recovery journey.
Okay, sure. So, I started using heroin at 16. I had no problem functioning on it and keeping it a secret. And that really drove me crazy. The lifestyle just of, deceit and risks all the time. So I wanted to stop and I kept telling myself, you can be okay without this stuff. I mean, the greatest trick of opioids is because they make you feel so good, you feel like I don't need this crap. And then you stop and you're like, shit, I need that stuff. So I stopped a few times, but I always went back. And then my mom went away. It was just before my 19th birthday. I forced myself into this cold turkey kick at her house while she was away. And somehow in the middle of it, I ended up calling my father, who I hadn't talked to in about a year. And I don't remember calling him, but he showed up and I told him what was going on. And he took me to this detox at a local hospital. And I kind of came to my senses a few hours into it.
Yeah.
And I left and I called him and I told him to, pick me up, that this wasn't what I wanted to do. So my mom was home at that point and they decided that I needed to go to rehab. And at that point, I was so ashamed of the heroin that I couldn't tell them why I was using it. So I asked if I had to go to rehab. And at the time, people, like, you plan for college 4 years out, but nobody plans to send their kid to rehab. So it was just, they call whoever. It happened to be my aunt, my father's sister, who knew of Hazelden, where I went. And, so it was, this is what you need to do. And if that kind of 90s mentality of like one more hit and he's going to die, so, which I guess is much more true today than it was then.
Right, because it can be laced with so many different things.
Yeah, exactly. So they shipped me off to Hazelden. And as soon as I got there, I was totally unfamiliar with, I mean, I knew that AA existed, but I didn't know anything other than, that it was a thing. So I got there and my counselor explained that I had a disease and that remission was only possible by putting my life and will in God's hands and working the steps of AA. And at that point, my mom had cancer twice by then. And I just thought I was a pretty devout atheist by then. And God, just everything that they were saying didn't make any sense to me. God didn't do anything for my mom's cancer, but he's helping, junkies and drunks and crackheads.
Right.
That was a thought in my head. I don't mean to be using stigmatizing language, but that's what I was thinking. And then also this business of the powerless and the disease, like I chose to stick needles in my arms. It was a very conscious decision. Mom didn't wake up one day and say, I'd really love to get cancer. That would be awesome. So it just, none of it made any sense to me. And I tried to explain, for the first time, I admitted to any living person that I was using heroin because I was terribly depressed. And my addiction wasn't a disease. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem. And depression is a biological condition. God is not known to cure any diseases. So I really didn't see how any of this was going to help me. And my counselor was just like, you're an addict, you're in denial, depression's an excuse, and all of the, kind of AA-isms that you really, there's no way to refute it works when somebody says that to you,
Right.
So, and at the time, this is in 1995. So, certainly addiction science was more advanced than it was 100 years earlier, but there was very much the, moral and criminal elements of it. And I didn't know, I believed that drug addicts were bad people. And so I must be a bad person. And I just felt so awful about it. And I knew a few other heroin addicts at the time, and they had all, depression was the gateway for everyone that I knew. But in rehab, they're telling me, no, you're an addict. This is a disease, all that stuff. So it was very hard to reconcile. I couldn't. And I was just constantly berated for not getting with the program and putting my, faith in God, and you can't do this alone. And so they told my mom, she came up for visiting weekend, and my counselor told her that I'm an addict in denial, and it's so bad that if she's not careful, I'm going to drink hand sanitizer if I'm that desperate for a high. And I'm going to be dead, and it's going to be like 5 minutes before I'm dead. And if you don't want your son to, end up dead, then, this is what you need. So he scared the shit out of me.
Wow.
Yeah. And I remember talking to her and just begging with her and explaining, my side of the story. And my mom, I was always, so smart and so handsome and so great in her eyes. So the fact that I was a heroin addict really, pulled the rug out from under her, but it didn't change, her love and her want to believe that I'm still this, smart, handsome dude. I don't know how handsome plays into it, but it can't hurt to tell you that my mom thinks I'm handsome, right? So, especially if there's no video. So I remember her sitting there and saying, like, what if you're wrong? And at the time, of course, I was outraged, but now, certainly as a parent, I totally get it. Yeah. She's in the preeminent rehab of this great rehab. She's got these experts telling her, this is what's going on. I'm a 19-year-old kid who spent the last 3 years in secrecy as a heroin addict. So she didn't have a choice. And I understand that now. Neither of us knew at the time the kind of anomaly that addiction treatment is, insofar as my counselor never graduated from high school. He ended up telling me at one point that the worst thing he ever did was smoke a cigarette. Every now and again, he drinks beer on Sundays for football games. So he really, he was just a guy who showed up for a job, and they trained him, and they trained him in addiction is the problem. So, and addicts lie, and this is what addict behavior is. And so I understand how in his eyes, I was an addict in denial. So they sent me to, the director of the program met with my mom and I, and they said that I had to go to this halfway house. Before rehab, I thought I was going to go to rehab and come home, But now it was, you need a halfway house, and maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 18 months, who knows? And the deal was, you can't do this alone. You need to find your higher power. If you don't go to the halfway house, we're cutting you off, and all the tough love, business that we now know is, not the way to go. So I went to the halfway house reluctantly, knowing that it was insanity. And there was another guy there who I'd met in Hazelden. He left maybe a week after I got there. Oh, I should probably mention I actually got kicked out of Hazelden a few days early for making out with a girl. That's pretty cool, right? So they sent me to this halfway house. There was a guy there who I'd met in Hazelden, and he was also a heroin addict, same age, same kind of story. Parents got divorced. He was depressed. And we both knew that neither of us had kept track of our sober days, because we knew that relapse was inevitable. We couldn't live without heroin. We didn't want to. The first chance we got to score, we were going to. So we're in West Palm Beach in that, recovery corridor that's so notorious now. And Steve, my friend, heard about this detox center up the street that was putting you in touch with drug dealers, because if you had drugs in your system and you peed in a cup and failed or passed, I guess, the urine test, they could admit you, and they give you $100 Visa gift card even.
What?
Yeah. So apparently that kind of stuff is still going on down there, but it was just rampant at the time. So yeah, so Steve gets this dealer's phone number. I'd been there for, I don't know, maybe a week, if not less. And I had made plans to see my grandparents the next morning. They lived, I don't know, an hour away. So Steve tells me he's got this dealer's phone number and we can score and whatever. And I spent all afternoon thinking about it. And I realized that, the pain that I'd caused my mom just from being a heroin addict was immeasurable. And then she was there when I got kicked out. She's got these experts telling her all of this stuff that I know is not true. But the only way to prove that I don't have a disease is to demonstrate that I have control, that I'm not powerless. Really, the foremost thought was, if I get caught and I get kicked out of this place, it's going to kill my mother. I can't do that. So, and it's interesting because at the time I was so literal and so anti-religion that it didn't even occur to me that my mother was my higher power.
Your higher power. I was just going to say that. Yeah.
So I saw Steve before dinner and I told him, it's not worth the risk. We're going to get caught. We're in a fucking halfway house surrounded by addicts. There's no way we're not going to get caught. So he agreed. His parents gave him the same tough love ultimatum of, if you don't stay at the halfway house, we're cutting you off. So we decided we weren't going to do it. And I went to sleep that night feeling really good about myself. And we had actually joked about, we should call our counselors in Hazelden and be like, see, we could resist and it's not a disease and all that business. So I went to bed. I woke up in the morning and Steve was dead.
Wow.
Yeah. So that...
Was it from a heroin overdose?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He scored. And he was the first friend that I knew who died from overdose. And, being 19 and feeling immortal, it never occurred to me that was, obviously I knew it was possible, but I didn't think that. So my grandparents picked me up. We were supposed to just go to lunch, but I told them I wanted to stay with them. And I didn't tell them about Steve. I didn't tell anybody about Steve until a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
So I ended up staying with them and I somehow managed to convince them and my mother that this whole system was crazy and I didn't need it to stay clean. And I genuinely believed that the permanence of, Steve's, of death was going to reinforce my resolve to abstinence, that was all I needed. It was kind of a scared straight moment. So I'm at my grandparents' house, that same day, less than 12 hours after Steve is dead. And we were going to go out for dinner and my grandfather, he said, if you want to shave, I have extra razors in the bathroom thing. So I went in there and there's this giant bottle of Darvocet. They didn't make anymore. But it was a pretty powerful opioid back in the day. And I knew what it was. And, I just was standing there staring at the bottle thinking there's no way that I'm not going to take this Darvocet. So let's just get it over with. And I did. And everything was okay. It was that feeling,
Yeah. That euphoria.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even euphoria. It was just like, this is what normal people normally feel like, you know?
Mm. So when did you realize that you needed help that wasn't in line with the traditional 12 steps or abstinence only based models?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I knew about buprenorphine in the 90s when clinical trials were going on for it, but I didn't know exactly what it was. I thought it only helped you to go through withdrawal. I didn't realize it was a maintenance drug. And I wanted very much to be on methadone, but the idea of being handcuffed to a clinic was just crazy to me. So it seemed like abstinence was the only option. But when I was abstinent, I couldn't really function. I mean, I built a successful career on heroin. I got fired when I was sober. I got sober. I met my wife. I was sober for about 4 months when I met my wife. And, you know, certainly the newness of love and all of that helped me to forget about the heroin. But after a while, I mean, basically it's like, if you look at it like depression is, you know, a very real thing. And if my leg got chopped off, right, and a doctor prescribed opioids and somebody said, stop taking them tomorrow, but the wound hadn't healed yet, nobody would expect me to suddenly feel so much better because I stopped taking the medicine that's helping me feel better, right? Mm-hmm. So I looked at it that way. Like, I haven't healed the wounds that led me to the dope in the first place. Why would I feel better without it? So it wasn't so much I needed treatment other than abstinence. It was, how can I find a reliable source of any type of opioid consistently and safely? And that was really more my objective than, you know, being clean, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. But every time I used, I felt so guilty about it because nobody knew. I mean, I led my family and everyone in my life to believe that, you know, I kicked when I was 18 and I never looked back and I was happy and sober and all of that kind of stuff. And I relapsed my way through my 20s and it was just awful. I mean, I was just tearing myself apart with the guilt and the shame, but I didn't know what to do. And so many times I thought, like, death is the only option. I can't live with, I can't live with heroin. I can't live without it. Like, there's no other option. I can't live. So I was very much just, you know, wishing for death and thinking of ways to kill myself, but there was so much shame in suicide that I couldn't do that. So it was really, I just felt trapped until my daughter was born. It was just before I turned 30. And I knew that I was never going to use opioids again. I just knew it. And she was like maybe a year old when the familiar feelings started to come back. And I didn't know what to do.
Explain those feelings.
Just, it's this awful pain, emotional pain of everything is wrong. I'm a terrible failure. I'm completely not worthwhile. Everybody's just being nice to me because they don't want to be the person responsible for, you know, pushing me off a roof. I'm not doing anything worthwhile. You know, and in the meantime, like, I have this very big job and I keep getting promotions and raises. And I think that I'm fooling everybody. So I feel guilty about that. And it's just this awful, you know, fraud complex. And I have no motivation to do anything. Nothing is pleasurable. And I'm just pretending, and it's awful. And like, my stomach hurts and my back hurts. So Ruby, my daughter, when she was around 2, I had this surgery I had a deviated septum. So I get the surgery, and like a week later, I got this awful headache, and I'd never had anything like it before. I always thought migraine was what like wimpy people called headaches. I didn't realize it was actually a thing, you know?
Yeah.
So I ended up in the hospital because of this complicated migraine, and they pumped me full of, you know, morphine and whatever. And I didn't, you know, have a problem. I mean, it was an emergency. Like, there was no question I needed. I wasn't even getting high. It was like barely, you know, killing the physical pain. But they sent me home with a prescription for Percocet, which I knew when I crossed the line, you know, like I was taking it for, you know, physical pain and thinking at the time, I mean, I'm very, you know, well-versed in our, you know, country's drug laws and the history of all of that. And I mean, opioids were the default medications for physical and emotional pain until, you know, the Harrison Act in 1914. So I'm like resenting the law, but also aware that, I'm going to pass the point of no return if I don't stop this. And I called for a refill one day, and I went downstairs, and Ruby and Andrea, my wife, were like making me these get well soon cards. And it was just heartbreaking. And so Andrea went to the gym, and I said I had to go to the drugstore, and it was like just right down the street. So Ruby and I walked to the drugstore. We get back home, and I knew that I had to get rid of this Percocet. And I'd never flushed drugs down the toilet before in my life. Mm-hmm. But Ruby, I brought Ruby in the bathroom, and I dumped the Percocet into the toilet and flushed them.
What made you decide to do that?
I know that I was going to keep taking the Percocet. I was going to like the way that it felt.
Yeah.
It was going to run out at some point. I was going to do something desperate. I didn't know at that point it was, 5 years since I had bought heroin on the street. By then, Giuliani had done his cleanup job on New York City. I had heard from plenty of people that, like street drug dealers were obsolete at that point. So the idea, I wouldn't know where to get it. Mm-hmm. And even if I did, the idea that, I would get beat up or by poison or, something terrible was going to happen. Like, it's not a very safe, operation. So I couldn't do that. And I knew, I was very aware in that moment that Ruby was my higher power.
Yeah.
So the next day, I had this feeling that like, I have this kind of momentum right now, but this isn't going to carry me forever. The wound is still there. Love isn't the answer. As powerful as love is, it's not. I got to deal with this.
It's not heroin. Yeah.
It's not heroin. Exactly. It's a totally different thing. So I ended up with buprenorphine. By then, I learned that you could use it for maintenance. There were very few doctors. This was 2008, so it was long before the opioid crisis. I got a list of buprenorphine licensed doctors. I called everyone within like 200 miles of my house. And when I talked to them and I said, by the time that happened, like there was no opioids in my system. And they all said the same thing. We can't, you need to have opioids in your system for us to treat you. You can't just show up here. And I said the same thing to all of them, which is, look, in order to pass your test, I have to score drugs. And if I do that, there's no fucking way I'm coming to see you, So, and this is, I don't know what to, that's a huge problem today. We're using buprenorphine to prevent relapse. So one doctor, the last doctor on the list, when I explained the, push-pull, he agreed to see me. And I went in and he gave me a couple of the 2 milligram tablets, and they dissolved under my tongue. And I just felt okay. It was that feeling of everything's okay. Mm. And I've been taking it every day since.
Wow.
But along the way, like the buprenorphine triages the physical dependence, and it, kind of saturates my opiate receptors. So they think that they're, being taken care of by opioids, but it doesn't cure the depression, the same way that opioids for, when your leg gets chopped off, it doesn't cure your leg. It just, it numbs the pain. So I got back into therapy. Mm-hmm. I started seeing not an addiction psychiatrist, but just a, standard therapist, psychiatrist. And he really just went to work on me. And I still see him every week as well.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you finally found somebody that was a good fit, because I feel like that's also really important. You could be the best therapist, psychiatrist in the world, but if the therapist's morals and values aren't aligning with yours, as far as treatment is concerned, right? Because treatment for addiction is very different than treatment for, anxiety, right?
Yeah, no, it really is. And I think the key is he understood why I was using the heroin. He wasn't looking at it as, oh, this is an excuse. Because when you roll it up as addiction is the problem and everything is an excuse, you're invalidating the underlying issues that drove you to the drugs in the first place. And I would argue that whether it's opioids or alcohol or compulsive gambling, or hoarding or, sex or whatever. Like we're looking to compulsive exercise, like we're looking to fill a hole.
Right.
And it's not like, you take a hit of something and you're instantly hooked. It's the relief that hooks you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and opioids are different than other. I mean, obviously every type of substance is different. Like the mechanics of a hit are the same biologically between like a hand of blackjack and a hit of heroin, but opioids are the only type of substance that has a natural target in your brain, and they take hold with just such ferocity that's different than any other type of substance. So, your neurotransmitters rewire, and that saying of, sobriety gets easier with time is true for, you quit smoking cigarettes, you quit drinking, whatever it is, like, your brain starts to heal and everything gets better. There's been, major studies that shows significant dysfunction in opioid addicts' brains after very long periods of abstinence. And, so you figure if every hit is multiplying your opiate receptors and they need to be saturated, it's like you've got this massive field of receptors that are screaming. And
they want to get back to that. They're expecting that there's that certain amount of drug coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And that doesn't change for everybody.
Yeah.
And it certainly hasn't for me. And so, the idea, like we're in this culture of abstinence is the solution. And I don't believe that. And I never believed that. And my family to this day has very mixed feelings about, when are you going to stop taking that crap? You don't need to be taking it, blah, blah, blah. And I would say to them, like, what's the objective here? Do you want me to be like so fucking miserable that I'm thinking about jumping off a roof? Or do you want me to have a body that is pure of, foreign substances? Because, I eat cookies that are, like there's all kinds of things that, so what are we trying to accomplish here? And I think that's a very crucial piece that's missing in, our response to the opioid crisis, because if we wanted to save lives and get people well, then medically assisted treatment, which is proven to be more effective than anything else, would be, ubiquitous. But we still have this attitude of, you need faith and you need abstinence. That's the predominant model.
Yeah. And also there are very few physicians, I think you mentioned this a little bit ago in this episode, where, there are very few physicians that can prescribe buprenorphine. Like you have to have specialized training in order to do this. And so it's amazing that during this opioid crisis that we're not addressing those gaps, right?
It's crazy. I mean, France had an epidemic of opioid addiction in the 90s. They changed their laws so every physician could prescribe. Overdose fatalities dropped by 79%.
Wow.
A very good friend of mine, who was my next door neighbor for years, is Brandon Del Pozo. He was an NYPD cop for the longest time, and then he ended up as Burlington's police chief. And I met him, before I got sober, and he had no idea about my past. And so I started opening up to him, and I told him I was on buprenorphine. And, when Chittenden County in Vermont decriminalized buprenorphine possession unofficially and then officially,
wow.
And saw a 50% reduction in overdose fatalities. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, because addiction and drug use is so wrapped up in the morality and criminal and all of that kind of business. Like if this was a coronavirus, we wouldn't be withholding the cure.
Right.
And that's really what it is. So it's very clear that our priority as a country is interdiction, not treatment. I mean, we spend 12 times more money on jails and going after cartels than we do treating people and treating the actual cause of addictions. So I think we've got to get away from the morality if we want to, saving lives is clearly not the priority. Our priority is enforcing laws.
Agreed. I mean, I do see some change. Like I know where I live here in Richmond, there is something called an angel network. And if someone calls and has overdosed, the first thing that the cop will do is they will go to the scene, they'll bring their treatment. I can't think of the name right now, and they will ask the individual, do you want to go to treatment or do you want to go to jail? I mean, there's a choice now, whereas before I feel like it was, you're going to jail.
Yeah. Yes. That's definitely going on. And that's great. But the flip side of that is our predominant treatment program invalidates the reason that people use drugs. And, many treatment centers, I think it's like 36% of rehabs have medically assisted treatment. So if you go to an AA-based treatment center, your methadone and buprenorphine, with very few exceptions, are not, abstinence is the only option. I met a woman recently who lost her son to overdose in July, Jennifer Hornack. She's amassing a pretty good following on Twitter. I'm just in awe of her bravery and candor right now. But her son was on buprenorphine. He was going into a treatment center. They said, no, you need to be abstinent. They forced him to wean off, and he died. And,
wow.
I've heard that same story from more parents than I can count at this point.
Yeah.
There was a kid in Arkansas a few weeks ago. I think I posted about it on Twitter, although I don't know if I said it was in Arkansas, where he was on bupe. It was like a quick, wean program. He felt like he needed it. He thought he was going to relapse. They wouldn't put him back on, and he died.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a final question for you, and you're going to jump in a time machine. So get ready.
Okay.
If you had a time machine and you could travel into the future, what would you see? What would recovery look like in the distant future?
Is this time machine taking me to my ideal future, or?
Yeah, it is. Okay. It is. Your miracle future.
Okay. In my miracle future, drugs are legal and regulated. All drugs are legal and regulated. But we have a very strong prevention program that's based on reality, not just say no. And we realize who's at risk for becoming an addict, and we try to intervene before it's too late. But if it doesn't work out, treatment certainly for opioid addiction involves methadone, buprenorphine, and pharmaceutical grade heroin. And for everything else, I forget what it's called, but there's a few options for alcohol. A friend of mine is taking one of these medications. There was a great article in Atlantic a few years ago about a doctor in Finland who pioneered this new alcohol treatment program. It seems
really,
yeah.
Can you send me the link?
I will do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like we have to get away from this idea that abstinence is, recovery. Sobriety and recovery are two completely different things, right? So if we want people to recover and it requires them to take medication, there's a difference between addiction and dependence. Maya Salovitz had a great article in the New York Times a few years ago about that. And I think that, we need to get away from this old thinking that has been debunked over and over. It's the disregard of science. I think in my time machine, when I get out of the DeLorean, we accept science and facts. It's like we're arguing with facts.
Right. And but also keeping that spirituality in place. I think that you do also need some sort of higher power, whether it's your future self or whether it's your Ruby or whether it's, something just to kind of, something that isn't involving your brain, right?
Yeah.
Your current brain.
Exactly. Yeah. You need something. And just the language, it's like the idea you can't do this without God. Like that's very different than you can't do this without feeling like you have something to live for.
Right.
It's
good. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. David, thank you so much for being on the show. And how can the listeners best find you and say hi on social?
Okay, so I'm David the Kick on Twitter. I'm David_the Kick on Instagram, although I don't really use Instagram that much anymore. I'm davidposes.com. I have a bunch of other domains, but they all link there. And if you want to get in touch with me, there's contact information on my website. I try to respond to everyone that I hear from. So, please get in touch.
That sounds great. Okay. Thanks again, David, for being on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.